I usually get my dad a Kohl's gift card for Father's Day every year, but one year I thought, how many pairs of socks and underwear and bed sheets does a dad need? So I thought, let's get him Cubs tickets. Mark and I were going to be back in Indiana over Father's Day. This is in 2016, and we thought, let's take my dad to the Cubs game. It'll be fun. It'll be something different. So we surprised my dad with the Cubs tickets, and on the morning of the game, it's a spring morning in June, we wake up early. It's a 3-hour drive from Fort Wayne, Indiana to Chicago. And I notice when I wake up, my stomach feels a little off. I'm like, well, maybe I'm just hungry. I'll grab a protein bar, get in the car, and we start our trip. As the time and the drive went on, my stomach's only feeling worse, though. It wasn't just hunger pains, and things escalate pretty quickly, like it's feeling tight and it's twisting and turning. And I'm like, Dad, you gotta pull over right now. And thankfully he acted quickly, because I've often prayed for the floodgates of heaven to open in my life, but I have never experienced the floodgates of my stomach opening in such a violent manner. You guys, I'm standing there on the side of the road. It's coming out of both ends at the same time. I have a picture to show you. No, I'm just kidding. Thankfully, Mark did not take a picture in that moment. He was probably like, I didn't know this was possible. I'm like, but with God, all things are possible. Right? Anyway, Dad, I'm not going to be able to continue on to the game. Like, I have never had an episode like this on the side of the road. I'm sure people driving that route have never witnessed a sight like this. I have left my favorite jean shorts in the bathroom of this random gas station in the middle of nowhere, Cornfield, Indiana. I'm not going to be able to go to the game. So he's like, I'll call my best friend, and his wife can come pick you up, Rachel. It's only an hour drive. I have to wait there on the side of the road. And so my dad and Mark still wanted to go to the game. So they continue on. They take my dad's friend, and I get in the car with his wife, and I go back home. And I continue to get sick hour after hour like clockwork, and I'm alone. We're newly married. Mark's not here right just yet, but he's aware of this story. Things only get worse. I'm thinking, this is probably food poisoning. I'm sure I'll be better in the morning. So the next morning, I wake up, and I can't stand all the way up without this shooting pain in my abdomen on the right side. And I keep thinking, we got to fly back to California the next day. We have our tickets and all that. And I keep thinking, well, maybe I'll just rest extra today and I'll be fine. My mom comes over that night after she gets off work to say goodbye to me. She thinks we're leaving the next day. And she's like, you're not going on that airplane. We're going to the hospital. You are not okay, Rachel. Thank goodness for motherly wisdom. We get to the ER. And within an hour, they discover that my appendix has started to perforate, which means it's in the early stages of rupturing. Maybe some of you saw where this story was going. And I get prepped for emergency surgery. They take out my appendix, and we have to spend another 7 days in glamorous Fort Wayne, Indiana, as I recover. It was an experience that is still memorable to this day. This morning, we're in our third week of a series on generosity, Jesus, money, and the good life. And this morning, we are looking at the fears surrounding money and giving. Really, the question for this morning will be, do you trust God as your provider? And that's what we're looking at. And you might wonder how a story about an appendix has anything to do with God and money. It had been pretty easy for us to trust God that first year of our marriage, because things were stable. We had steady jobs, we worked hard, we tithed 10% regularly. We had enough money to pay our bills. And so it was like, yeah, of course we trust God with our finances. And then one day, we get a bill from the hospital in the mail. Now, we had just bought our first house in Long Beach. So we now have a mortgage payment. We no longer qualify for the young adults ministry. We have a mortgage payment. We're having our first big adult responsibility. And we get this bill from the hospital, and it says, your insurance has paid this much. Here's the portion that you owe. And I'm used to it being $0 or $200 for the ER copay visit, whatever. And it says $26,000 is what you owe. I'm like, man, you guys took one of my organs. Wasn't that enough? I'm like, this will be okay. I'm sure we can work this out. We're not actually going to have to pay that. This is just, kind of the process, and I'm sure there was a glitch somewhere in the system. I spent the next 12 months, almost every day of the week, fighting on the phone with our health insurance company and the hospital, trying to get them to communicate together on the grounds of, even though we were out of state and out of network, this was an emergency surgery, and according to your guidelines, this should be covered. All I should owe is $250 for my copay to the ER. But that is not how they saw it. And they were insistent, you are going to pay this $26,000. There's nothing more that we can cover. We logged how many minutes I spent on the phone with HealthNet, and it totaled 36 hours. This is over a year. You can imagine this was a highly frustrating and stressful situation. But I will tell you, I had this really weird, strange peace this whole time. I knew that somehow God was going to come through. He was going to provide. We didn't have $26,000. We were pretty broke. We just bought our first house. We're like in our, mid to late 20s. We did not have like a backup plan. But I didn't think we even needed one because I was like, I know God's going to come through on this. I didn't know how though. Mark did not see the situation the same way I did. He had a lot of anxiety over it. And while I was stressed and annoyed by the situation, his was like, I am growing in fear and panic and anxiety as the months go on because this bill's not disappearing, Rachel. And it was a point of tension between us. He thought I was being overly optimistic. I was like, you're not trusting God enough. You're being a pessimist in this. He's like, no, I'm being a realist. That's what all pessimists say. He was annoyed by my optimism about it. And I actually took a bill, I put it on our fridge from the hospital that said $26,000 is what we owed. And I put a bright sticky note on it. And I wrote paid in full in Jesus' name. And that hung there for 12 months. And I couldn't explain how I had this weird faith sense that it was going to be okay. But I will say on the day that our hospital bill showed up in a pink envelope and it had collection stamped on the front of it, I questioned, wait, God, are you really going to come through for me? I've been banking on the fact that you would. I've been trusting and putting my hope in the fact that you would. I feel like I'm kind of left hung out here to dry. Like this would be a great time for you to come through, for you to show up. And the fear that Mark had been feeling, it started to get to me too. Research shows that the primary reason that people don't give is not because of how much money they do or don't have. It's because of fear. Fear is the number one thing that keeps people from being generous. You probably know that. You've probably felt that before in some time in your life. One pastor puts it this way. He says, our generosity today is crippled by fear about tomorrow. In situations like this, it becomes pretty clear your degree of trust that you have in God. It's like you're holding a magnifying glass up to the way that your heart really views God. Is he going to come through for you or not? And we were on different pages in our marriage about this. It's at times when you read the words of Jesus in Matthew 6, when you're really looking for God to come through and he seems absent. You read the words of Matthew 6 about God taking care of feeding the birds and clothing the lilies and making the grass grow. And you're like, okay, God, that sounds really nice and beautiful. And maybe you remembered them and the birds and the flowers, but I feel like you've forgotten about me, if I'm honest. Maybe some of you came in this morning feeling that way. So we're going to be in Matthew 6 this morning, starting in verse 19. If you need a Bible, we have free orange ones in the seats in front of you. You are welcome to take that home with you. You can open that up to page 661 as I read these words of Jesus. He writes, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin, which is rodents, destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. Burglary was fairly common in the ancient world. People would literally bury their treasure, what was most important to them in their household. They didn't have safes. They would bury it under the floor of their house so that if an intruder were to come in, a thief were to come in, they would be out of sight. The problem, though, was that even if their treasure was safe from robbery, usually rodents or moths would get to it first, and it would end up getting destroyed. So that's the context that Jesus is speaking directly into. There is a deep beating in the human heart, and it's been there for the start of time, for us to store up treasures. We want to keep close the things that matter to us, our possessions. Jesus doesn't rebuke that impulse. And I think that's fascinating to note here. As John Mark Comer notes, Jesus says the problem isn't that you want to store up treasure, but that we want to store it in the wrong place, here on earth rather than in heaven. What do you mean store up treasure in heaven while we're living on earth? What am I supposed to do? Like toss up my possessions and my paychecks to the sky? No. The phrase in heaven was a Hebrew phrase. So when Jesus is using this, he's like, store up your treasures in heaven. It means store them up in God and in the work that God is doing here on the earth. That's a more accurate translation of in heaven. Because Jesus says the next verse, in verse 21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This is sort of the punchline of Jesus' sermon here. It's that money is not about money. Money is actually about your heart. Money is not about money. It's ultimately about your heart. And Jesus knows that. See, we think that money follows our heart, but it works both ways. What we spend money on, our heart comes to treasure. We come to love, to worry, and to stress over the things that we spend on. And what's crazy here, God doesn't say spending is bad. He doesn't say don't spend. He's not being stingy or cheap. He's saying, I want you to spend on what matters. Instead of looking for instant gratification or keeping up with the trends or the pull of materialism, he's saying, invest and spend your money on what will get you an eternal ROI, what will make an impact and withstand in the age to come. Randy Alcorn, he's a pastor and author, he writes, you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. And I love that notion. When we store up treasures on earth, it doesn't take long until our hearts become gripped with fear over losing them. And that's why Jesus says what he says next in verse 22 through 23. He says, now the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Hold on, Jesus. We were just talking about money. Like, what's this vision, eyesight, darkness, light thing have anything to do with that? I'm kind of thirsty. Pardon me for a second. I'm going to pour myself a glass of water here. Here's my cup of water. Here's how much water I have to drink today. Who looks at this and sees a half-empty glass? You can raise your hand. It's a safe place. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now, who looks at this glass, ignore the fingerprints, and sees a half-full glass? There are two different ways to see the same exact glass. Now you might think, okay, that's not really a big deal. It's just the way the glass looks and how much water you have. But let me show you what impact this has on me based on how I see this glass. Oh my gosh, I'm so thirsty. Like all I've needed is, this is all I get? This isn't gonna be enough. I'm gonna take a drink and I'm still gonna be thirsty. Okay, where can I go after this to get more money? How am I gonna be able to get more water? I'm gonna need more water. This isn't enough. I can feel my throat tightening. I can feel the anxiety rising in my body. If I see this glass is half empty, there is not enough here to meet my need. Or, I have been so thirsty. I can't believe I get almost half of an entire glass to drink. Oh my gosh, I'm so thankful. Wow, I mean, I actually have more left. Does anybody need some water? Is anybody else? I have more than enough. I can give some away. Anybody need a drink? Two people can love Jesus and see that glass in opposite ways. Now, the way that you viewed this glass today, whether you raised your hand or not, you had a feeling about the glass, whether it was half empty or half full. That's not a reflection of how you walked in here and how you feel today, how your eye sees it. That's the accumulation of a vision, how you view money, how you view the world that's been forming since you were a child. All sorts of factors contribute to the way that you see this glass. It's your family of origin, how money was talked about in your home, if it was a topic of stress and lack and never enough, if it was a source of instability and anxiety, has to do with the socioeconomic background of the neighborhood that you grew up in. Maybe even the generational patterns of how money was handled in your family. Could even be the time in history when you were born. If you were born into a recession or a depression and that's how you grew up, that impacts the way that you view how much is in this cup. Jesus talks about healthy eyes or unhealthy eyes. That was a figure of speech back in the first century. So people knew what he was getting at. It seems a little foreign to us, but the word in the Greek that he uses to talk about a healthy eye implies generosity. He's saying you have a generous eye if. And then on the other side, the word that he uses to describe an unhealthy eye, it implies stinginess. Commentators have kind of parsed those out into what we would call an abundance mindset and a scarcity mindset. Two different ways of looking at the world. So I'm going to put up a little chart to help you walk through these and see them. Maybe you can identify which one feels more like me. And just so you know, there's no shame in if you realize, hey, I view the world with a scarcity mindset. Most of us do. It is our culture's default. So you know you have a scarcity mindset if you look out at the world and you see lack. You view the world as a dangerous place. There's not enough to go around for everybody. It's dog eat dog, it's cutthroat. Nobody's looking out for you. If you want to make sure your needs are met, you've got to look out for you. There's no father, provider. You want what you don't have continuously. What you do have, you are gripped with fear about losing it. When you're not in a financial crisis, but your heart's default mode, it's consumed with fear, with greed, or with anxiety around finances. Jesus would call this an unhealthy eye. And he would call it unhealthy because he would say this is a distorted view of the world. This is not how I want you to view the world. On the other hand, an abundance mindset, a healthy eye, looks out at the world and sees enough to go around. You see God as your father and provider. You see yourself as his child. You view the little things in life as gifts. So you look around and you're constantly blown away or in awe, wow, look up at the birds. Isn't it crazy that somehow they found food to eat today? Or look at these flowers that bloom every year. It's amazing. You start to see the little things in God's good creation as huge gifts and blessings, and that leads to a gratitude that spills out of you towards God and a generosity that comes out of you towards others. Now, here's a tricky one, a good litmus test. You are able to both give and receive with joy. A lot of us can give, no problem. We have a hard time receiving. Jesus would say, if you have this mindset, an abundance mindset, you have a healthy eye and a healthy view of his creation. Jesus knows the human heart so well, and this isn't just about how you view money. It's about how you see everything around you. Two people can have the exact same income, same cost of living, live in the same city, same amount of kids, and they can see the world in radically different ways. In a lot of ways, we just saw that with a cup of water. Most of us, though, have a scarcity mindset, almost by default. Some of us don't even realize it. It's the water that we swim in American culture. According to a recent study conducted by Capital One, 77% of Americans feel anxious about their financial situation. That's 3 out of 4 people a little bit more than that. 57% of Americans admit to needing a mental reset when it comes to their money. And because this is the water that we swim in, even as followers of Jesus, this so easily infiltrates the way that we view the world, God, provider, money, everything. And so often when we hear Jesus' teaching about money, they sound absolutely ridiculous. It sounds like Jesus is unhinged, like he's lost his mind, because how we view money and how Jesus views money, it seems like we're living in two different worlds. And here's why. Verse 24, because no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. A lot of translations, instead of using the word money here in this verse, they use the word mammon. Mammon was an ancient Syrian god. It was the personification of greed, materialism, money. Like Mammon was a god who was worshiped, an idol, by people who wanted financial abundance. And so what Jesus is saying here is you can't worship both me and worship another god. It doesn't really work that well. I mean, you can't have two spouses. You can try, but it doesn't end well. Can you have two favorite sports teams? No. Louis, yes, you are great proof of that. Can you vote for both parties in a presidential election? No. You can't worship two gods. Now, we don't say it, but some of our lives reflect a belief that I think we can. We can have it both ways. We can say, yes, of course I worship God. I mean, I go to church for 90 minutes on a Sunday. Oh, but your bank account says you worship something else. And that can be a hard reality to come to grips with. That is the word of Jesus here. All of us, all human beings worship something. It's just part of the human condition. Atheists worship something. Secularists worship something. Buddhists worship something. And Jesus is saying it's not just bad that you worship the God of money. He's saying it's actually impossible for you to worship mammon. Why? Because an idol demands all of you. It's impossible for you to worship the God of money and me. Like any idol, money will take over your heart if that's what's most important to your heart. If you resist its often demonic pull. And Jesus makes it clear as day to his followers. He says, I am not like mammon. I am not like that finicky God of mammon who's going to take over your heart. I'm actually a good God, a good Father. I want to restore your heart. I want to help you walk into life that is truly life. I am not like the other gods. I am a good Father. And Jesus continues, verse 25, he says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? I mean, look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they are? Can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin, and yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all of his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all of these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all of these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Tim Keller puts it this way: worry is an indicator of worship. And that stings a little bit. What you worry about is what you don't want to lose. Therefore, Jesus says that worrying about money and your future is an indicator of a lack of trust in God. Worse, it shows that the heart's true hope is in wealth. So the antidote for money's poisonous effect in our lives is generosity. It's an antidote of drinking the sweet medicine of trusting in God's control over the future. See, the remedy for the poisonous effect of money on your heart, it's generosity. How do you work past the fear of giving? Generosity. How do you combat materialism? It's generosity. How do you stop worrying about and worshiping money? It's generosity. Thank you, Louie. Catching on. When you give money away, you stop worshiping it. For followers of Jesus, there's this circle of trust. And this imagery has been so helpful for me. When we give, God tells us he'll provide. In this passage, it's God's way of saying, as you give, I'll provide. It's not a money issue. Some of us, we kind of buy into the lie. We tell ourselves, well, I'll start giving when I get more money, when I get enough. So we might put that benchmark here, but that benchmark will just keep moving and moving as time goes on, because more money doesn't automatically make your heart more generous. And on the flip, some of us say, well, I'm just going to wait. I'm going to wait until I get into a more stable season of life. I'm just going to wait. But again, you're never quite stable enough. That benchmark just keeps moving and moving and moving, because waiting alone does not magically make the heart more generous. More money sometimes can often have the opposite effect of generosity. Many of us have forgotten the words of Notorious B.I.G. years ago. He told us, more money often equals more problems. It's not a money issue. It's a trust issue. Instead of saying, oh, I need more money, I need more time, I need more stability, Jesus says, you just need more trust in me. So when Mark and I were being faced with that collections bill for $26,000, as I shared about earlier, we looked at that situation differently. And it wasn't just because I had a holier perspective or something, or I don't know. There was nothing I had done in that moment that made my vision of the situation different. It was that about 7 years prior, God and I had worked out our trust issues together over money. I actually grew up in a scarcity mindset, in a home where every conversation we had around money, it felt tense. Like you could feel the tension, even though you're a kid growing up and you don't really know the implications of all this, but you could feel the stress over money. I felt like there wasn't enough. Now, the ironic thing is, my dad made a lot of money, more than what we make now, and that was, 25 years ago. We had a big house, 4-car garage, went on vacations. We had enough. We had more than enough. Which just goes to show it's not about how much you have. It's about where your heart's at with all of it. So I grew up in a scarcity mindset. But then early in my 20s, I was in a season where there literally was not enough. At least it seemed that way. My parents abruptly divorced after 26 years. My dad had filed, and my mom was given about $660 a month to live off of until their divorce was settled. So we're living in LA at the time. My mom, my sister, and me were sharing a 1-bedroom apartment, 3 girls. My mom gets $660 a month. I'm out of college. It's my first year out of college. I'm working as a production assistant in Santa Monica. I made $9 an hour. I worked 45 hours a week. I commuted 3 hours round trip from Burbank each day. Completely legal. Can you believe that? That was legal. It sounds highly illegal. My mom would go dumpster diving at night in our apartment complex. I remember she'd put on these yellow dishwashing gloves and would go look for bottles like this that she could recycle. And we'd take them in, and that would give us an extra $20 or $30. It was in this season that we were attending a church, and our pastor started talking about tithing. He did a series on tithing, and I had actually never heard tithing talked about before. And we were so desperate for something to put our trust in. We were so desperate for God to show up and provide. It was almost like we had nothing to lose. It was at this season in my life that I began tithing 10% of my income. So did my mom. She would give off of that $660 stipend she was given each month. We reprioritized our giving. It wasn't just like a casual toss a couple bucks in as the offering plates would go past. No, it was like, okay, when we pay our bills and we budget our expenses for the month, we budgeted in our tithe. And we started to take a step in the practice of generosity at a time that made absolutely no sense. And I'll tell you firsthand, 20 years in a scarcity mindset, but practicing generosity, especially in a season of lack, my heart encountered a radical change. It's like for the first time it clicked for me. I was actually relying on God as my Father to provide for me. Because if I'm honest, when I was just kind of like, oh yeah, sure, I have $5 or $10 left over this month, I'll give it. That to me, like, sure, that's great. It's better than nothing. But that wasn't me declaring, God, I trust you that you're gonna show up this month and get me through it. That just didn't touch my heart, if I'm being honest. But when I'm giving, and that season of life, giving 10%, and as I've continued to do, no matter the ebbs and flows of the seasons and jobs that I've been in, every month, that's my declaration. God, I am trusting you this month that you are gonna provide, that you're my good Father, you see my need, you take care of the lilies and the birds and the grass, you're gonna take care of me too. I experience that circle of trust. As I give, God provides. And so, when I'm faced with this appendix bill situation, it's only because God and I had worked out our trust issues with money years prior that I think Mark and I looked at that situation a little bit differently. I mean, when I started tithing with my mom and my sister, we saw provision that did not make sense. And I was always skeptical of that. I was like, sure, people just say that. Like, that doesn't happen in real life. One morning, we're out running. My mom trips on a sidewalk that was like a little bit uneven, a gap in the pavement. She doesn't just trip and fall and like get a little road rash. She lands on her cheek, fractures her jaw, and needs reconstructive surgery on her jaw. Horribly inconvenient, but she owed her oral surgeon $18,000 during this season. It's one of those things like, God, you have to come through. We don't have a backup plan. Her surgeon heard her story, and he wasn't even a Christian. He wrote off her entire bill. We had stuff like that happen, or like with groceries or whatever it was. God provided for us. I can't even recount the ways. Each month he did. I didn't move out of a scarcity mindset or a fear of giving by telling myself, oh, stop worrying, Rachel. Stop worrying about it. Just stop worrying. Just let it go. Just stop worrying. Come on, you got to try harder. Stop worrying. That didn't work. My heart only changed when I took a step in the practice of generosity. It's almost like God knew that money can get this poisonous grip on our hearts, but thank God we serve the great physician who says, I wrote a prescription for this. For your heart to not be consumed by worshiping the God of money. And that's the practice of generosity. My heart finally changed. Our priorities changed each month, and it changed how I viewed the whole world around me. Because for the first time it clicked, God was my good Father. Everything belongs to him, and there was going to be enough to go around. So, how that ended up working out with our appendix surgery, I still clung to that same faith. And I was like, God, don't make me look bad because I'm never going to hear the end of it. If Mark says, oh, I was right. We ended up getting some advice to hire a patient advocate, which is a thing I didn't even know existed. It's like a step down under an attorney. And they specialize in situations just like mine, trying to get the hospital and the insurance company to cooperate with each other. So I found this one out of LA. She was a little Jewish woman named Prissy Cohen. And I knew from the minute I heard that name, Prissy Cohen, this woman's gonna have a fight in her. Yeah, let's go Prissy Cohen. So we paid her a small retainer fee. And within a week, she got that bill down to my copay, where all I owed was $250. And I keep this little desktop image on my laptop. I've had it there since 2017 after we paid off that $250, and I saw that bill at zero because for probably 13 months, I looked at it saying $26,000 and then collection stamped on top of it. And I kept my Post-it note there, even when I felt like a fool, because I believed the God of Matthew 6 was going to provide for me. And you know what? That is still on my desktop with intentionality. The little title of the picture says Jesus wins over Parkview, because it's not like, oh, now I just don't care about money at all. Now of course. It's the water that we swim in. It's always going to be pulling after our hearts. I have to see a visual reminder every day when I open my laptop, God came through for me. He's going to do it today. Whatever I face, he's going to do it again. He's going to do it again. He's not lost a battle. And I keep that as a reminder in the forefront of my focus every day. Some of us, I think today, need to take a trust step and experience this reality. God just didn't do it for me. This is just his character. This is who he is. His promises, his provision and care is for you as well. I love what John Mark Comer says. He says, I can't flip a switch and remove all fear and greed from my heart, but I can sponsor a child. I can buy someone lunch this week. I can give a portion of my income away every month with special attention to the church, the gospel, and the poor. And as I practice generosity and make space for God to move in my heart, he can change my whole life from the inside out. Guys, I've seen him do it. Generosity isn't just about behavior. It's about our inner nature. It's about the heart. If we apprentice under Jesus, it should change our relationship to money because it should change our heart. So let me leave you with a challenge this morning. If you, like me, grew up in a scarcity mindset and that's all you've ever known, and you want to move into an abundant mindset, into seeing the world differently, as God writes about here. If you want to break free from that enslaving worry and panic over finances and move from grasping to a posture of gratitude each month, take a step in practicing generosity. I know it might sound absolutely foolish. It did to me. But it is the prescription for the epidemic of greed and fear that grips our hearts around money. Perhaps that means you start giving regularly for the first time. Maybe like me, back in my mid-20s, I started budgeting giving for the first time into my monthly expenses, and it wasn't just the leftover. Maybe right now you do give, but if you're honest, it's not really like declaring an act of trust. It's kind of easy for you. Maybe the next step in generosity for you is to give more. You know what God is putting on your heart, and only you can know that. But if we want to be serious about following Jesus, our lives are going to be marked with constant steps forward in the practice of generosity. We should be aiming to grow more generous with our time, with our talent, with our treasure, with our attitudes, with our forgiveness. We should become more and more generous every year that we follow Jesus. The real question: do you trust God as your Father who provides for you? I'm going to invite the worship team out. And we are going to celebrate corporate communion together today as a church family. We do this once a month. And we're also going to have people, trusted prayer team people up here at the front who would love to pray for you. If this is a big stumbling block for you this morning because you're like, I can't get the whole father provision thing. I didn't have a father who provided for me. Things have been unstable most of my life. But today you want to step into something new. You want to ask God to break that off of you. You want your vision to be corrected so you can see the world with a healthy eye. Come and get prayer for that. If you're in the middle of a financial battle, come and get prayer for that. If you feel it's a struggle for your heart to become more generous, come and get prayer for that. How can you trust God to meet your daily needs? the greatest proof is the cross. If we really let it sink in that God has already met our greatest need to be reconciled with God the Father, to have payment covering the debt from our sin, God already met that need on the cross. That is how we can trust that he will provide for our daily needs. And generosity is at the very heart of the gospel. God gave his one and only Son. Jesus gave up his Spirit. He gave up his place in heaven, it says, so that he may become poor, so that for our sake, through his poverty, we'd become rich. Luke 11 reminds us, as Jesus says, even you who are wicked know how to give good gifts to your kids. How much more does God in giving the Holy Spirit? Generosity and giving, it's the triune nature. It's the central part of the Trinity, central part of the gospel. It's that Jesus gave. He gave his body. He gave his blood. He gave his life for you and for me. So you're going to receive a wafer, and that represents Jesus' body that was broken for you on the cross. And you're also going to receive a small cup of juice, which represents Christ's blood that was spilled out to pay your debt, to cover the sin gap that stood in the way of a relationship between us and the Father. Because God met our greatest need already, being reconciled to God the Father, we can trust him with our daily needs. And so as you take communion in a minute, we're going to dismiss, and you can come up to the 4 tables, whichever one is closest to you. You can take the elements and go back to your chair and thank God for his generosity towards you. Thank God for his provision of eternal life for you. Ask God to change your heart more and more into the image of his generous heart. And maybe in this time, you need to sense God holding your hand. I kind of had this vision as I was writing this of like a 3-year-old toddler. They're walking around and they're grabbing on to their parents' hand and just looking up and looking at marvel and wonder in the world. And I know that some of you have lost that wonder because you've had to provide for yourself and you've had to figure life out without the help of someone holding your hand in the physical form. Today, God wants to reparent you. Say, I've got you. I've always been looking out for you. The proof of that is that you're here. I want you to experience my loving care and provision for you. You can trust me. You can trust me. Would you stand? Let's worship and partake of the elements together.